whenever we come to the Bible, we want to be sure that we've understood it properly. A few weeks ago, we saw how Jesus helps us with that, because after he rose from the dead, he spoke to his people, and he said that every part of the Bible, every part of the Old Testament in particular, pointed ahead to him. So when we come to a book like Esther, we need to ask, what's the distinctive contribution that this book makes to our understanding of Jesus? To understand that, we're going to need to look a bit further ahead in the story, but we're going to see that it points to the God who will keep his promises to rescue his people no matter what the odds are that are facing them. But there's another thing that the book of Esther shows us, and it shows us this through its most surprising feature, and that's that it doesn't mention God at all, not once. In fact, it barely even mentions anything religious. Karen Jobes, in her excellent commentary on the book of Esther, suggests that this is part of the genius of the writing of the book, because a key role of the book of Esther is that it's here to help us trust that God is in charge in the ordinary times in our lives, as well as in great and extraordinary events. That means that the silence of the book about God explicitly being involved in things is good news for those of us who live in ordinary times. If we think the Bible is a book which is mainly about miraculous events and great occasions in world history, then there's two dangers to that. First, it actually makes God smaller rather than bigger. If we think he rules over the special times, but he disappears again in the ordinary ones, then we actually have a God who's smaller. But the God of the Bible is infinite, awesome, and involved in every part of life. We say that he is sovereign. He rules over everything. He doesn't pop up from time to time, perform an impressive feat, and then fade away, leaving us to ourselves. That's not the God of the Bible. Secondly, if we think that the Bible is only concerned with miraculous events, it actually leaves us very distant from the Bible, because most of our lives are ordinary. I don't mean that our lives aren't important or fascinating or deeply meaningful and precious to God. What I mean is that they're not world-changing. They're not globally significant. They're not never see the like again kinds of lives. Well, mine isn't, but maybe yours is. The book of Esther is great news for anyone who doesn't find themselves experiencing the miraculous every single day. Look how the book starts. There's an entire chapter where there's no mention of anyone Jewish. There's no mention of Israel, and it takes place 1,000 miles away from Jerusalem. It's all context, but it's vital context for what God is going to be doing. The writer Barry Webb says that the absence of the miraculous does not mean the absence of God. So what is God doing here in this first chapter? Well, the key thing he's doing for the major plot of the story is that he's creating a vacancy at the heart of the Persian decision-making process. He's forming a vacuum that he's going to fill with a person of his choosing, and that person is going to bring about the rescue of God's people, save them from destruction. It really is that big. That's why the Jewish people have been celebrating the events of Esther for the last 2,500 years. God may well, as we've already seen, be showing up that the foolishness of this arrogant empire. But for the bigger story in Esther, what he's doing is he's creating an empty throne that he's going to fill. Because he's determined that this person is going to be used to preserve and protect his people. Elsewhere, Karen Jobe writes, when we think of redemptive history, we think of the great miracles that display God's power. But these mighty acts of God are linked together through long years of human history by a chain of seemingly insignificant, ordinary events. We're now living in one of those long stretches of history between the ascension and return of Jesus Christ. Like Xerxes of long ago, modern kings, presidents and rulers make decisions from purely political motives. Like Vashti, people today unwittingly make decisions that have long-reaching consequences, far beyond what they have foreseen. These events may be completely secular and perhaps made by people who give Christ no thought. Nonetheless, through them, God is moving all of history forward to accomplish all that must happen before the return of his Son, Jesus Christ, the true King of Kings. So, What does it look like to trust that God is in charge of the ordinary times in life, not just the extraordinary events? Firstly, if one of the reasons that you're not a Christian today is because you imagine that the God of the Bible is a God who's only interested in the religious bits of life or interested in the spiritual types of folks, then Esther really challenges your thinking. The God of the Bible we see here is at work at all times and in all places. In the good things you're blessed with, as well as the challenges you face today, he is involved. And if you come to him through what Christ has done, you'll find out just how good it is to live with him in charge, to live at peace with him. But it will involve laying down all pretense at the fact that we can live life independent of his rule. For Christians, for those who are following Jesus, it actually gives everything in life a new significance. We're not insignificant and worthless because our lives aren't filled with obvious miracles. No, nothing is wasted, and God is always at work. In the New Testament letter to the Colossians, Paul writes, "Whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him." Everything we do, you see, can be done for the glory of God, for the honour of his name, or not. Paul, who writes the letter, goes on to explain this isn't just about what we do in church life. It's true in home life, between husbands and wives, between parents and children, between employers and employees in the workplace. That's one of the areas where this really comes to fruition in what he writes. He writes that what you're paid, whether you're paid at all, the number of people you're in charge of, none of these things give your work true significance. It's your attitude that can give your work significance. He writes, "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving." Everything we do has significance because God is at work in all that we do. And finally, we need to say something about some wrong ways in which people have approached Esther in the past, approached the book of Esther. People have looked for who the people are to emulate, to follow as examples. They've wondered whether Esther is a good role model, or Mordecai, perhaps, who we'll meet next time, whether we should see something in Queen Vashti which is important. And yet, none of the characters in the book of Esther turn out, I would suggest, to be people who we want to see as great role models. Even the heroes have some serious flaws in the way they behave at times, and the baddies really are very bad indeed. Now, what's going on here, if anything, is that it sometimes shows us by some negative examples of thinking and behaviour in the Old Testament a better way of life under King Jesus, and certainly a better way of marriage than that in the kingdom of King Xerxes. If we look at what goes on between Vashti and Xerxes and the outcome of it in terms of the proclamation that's made, what we see is a very different view of marriage in Xerxes' world, and perhaps the world of today, to the view that the Bible paints of what Christian marriage should be like. In a Christian marriage, you see, there are two people who have deliberately submitted themselves to another master, Jesus Christ. That's the starting point of the Apostle Paul when he writes to the Christians in Ephesus, that they're to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And he goes on to speak to wives, yes, but he speaks to husbands at much greater length and in much greater depth. Why? Because he wants to show that their calling is a harder one. He says to husbands, "Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." How much did Christ love the church? All the way. He gave up everything for her. When Paul speaks about wives submitting to husbands, when Peter does it, it's always in the context of husbands laying down their lives for their wives. That changes the nature of the relationship in some deep and wonderful ways. One evangelical leader put it like this. He said, "Yes, I believe in a wife submitting to her husband, but I don't believe the husband ever has the right to demand it. In fact, I know that when I am worthy of submission, my wife submits, and when I am unworthy of it, she does not." My responsibility as a husband is to be worthy. I wonder if this is one of the ordinary but glorious ways in which God can work in and through you and me if we're Christian husbands, and indeed can work through Christian wives too. Esther chapter 1 ends with a message going out from the one who in those days regarded himself as the King of Kings, in a vain attempt to maintain his authority and maintain the status quo. But Matthew's Gospel, by contrast, ends with Jesus, the true King of Kings, sending out his messengers to tell the world of a king who has laid down his life for his people. Before we close, let's sing of the God who wondrously reigns over all things, who gently sustains his people in ordinary times as well as in the extraordinary ones.